Welcome back to the Daily Crypto Deep Dive. And this is part 2 of our altcoin supply series. Because in part 1, we explained why token supply is crushing so many smaller projects. And now we need to bring that back to the coins a lot of you may actually hold. If your portfolio has names like Ethereum, Solana, XRP, Cardano, Dogecoin, and maybe even BNB sitting in it, the real question is not just whether they can bounce. The real question is whether they still have the structure, the utility, the institutional backing, and the market conditions needed to perform from here, or whether some of them may never properly get back to their old highs at all. That is what we are breaking down today, coin by coin, with real facts behind the supply side and real analyst views behind the price outlook. This episode is sponsored by Kraken, one of the longest-standing and most trusted crypto platforms in the space. If you're buying, selling, or managing crypto and you want a platform known for strong security, deep liquidity, and a simple user experience, Kraken is well worth a look. It gives you access to a wide range of major coins, solid trading tools, and the kind of reliability that matters in a market where trust is everything. If you want to check it out and support the show at the same time, use the link in the description. So let's start with Ethereum, because if there is one big altcoin that still has the cleanest serious comeback case, it is probably Ethereum. And the reason starts with supply. Ethereum does not have the same endless unlock overhang problem that destroys so many smaller tokens. The supply is dynamic. New Ethereum is issued to validators, but part of transaction fees is burned, which means Ethereum can be inflationary or deflationary depending on network activity. That matters because it gives Ethereum a much healthier monetary structure than the average altcoin, where supply just keeps expanding no matter what. Now bring that back to your portfolio. If you hold Ethereum, the good news is you are not sitting in one of those classic dilution traps where every rally gets suffocated by a giant future unlock calendar. The bigger question with Ethereum is not whether supply is broken. The bigger question is whether demand can return strongly enough. On that front, the analyst view is still pretty constructive. Large institutional analysts have continued to argue that Ethereum could outperform Bitcoin in the right environment if ETF demand strengthens, network upgrades keep improving the chain, and activity across DeFi, stablecoins, and tokenized assets continues to expand. At the same time, some banks have reduced their near-term price targets compared with earlier, more aggressive forecasts, which tells you something important. Serious money still sees upside in Ethereum, but it is no longer treating that upside as automatic. My verdict on Ethereum is simple. If you are holding it, I would not put it in the done category at all. In fact, it is one of the stronger large-cap altcoin holdings because the supply design is more defensible, the institutional case is more mature, and the network still sits right at the center of stablecoins, DeFi, and tokenized assets. That does not mean it is guaranteed to fly straight back to all-time highs. It means Ethereum still has one of the clearest credible paths to doing so if broader flows improve. So for listeners holding Ethereum, this is still a coin you can justify owning with a straight face. Next is Solana, and this is where things get a bit more nuanced. Solana absolutely still has a strong performance case, but its supply story is not as clean as Ethereum's. Solana has a built-in inflation schedule. The network began with much higher issuance, and that rate reduces over time toward a lower long-run level. That means new Solana continues to be issued, and stakers earn rewards partly through that inflation mechanism. So unlike Ethereum, which can burn supply depending on usage, Solana still has a more obvious supply headwind built into the system. So if you hold Solana, the key question is whether usage and demand can outgrow that inflationary drag. That is where the analyst case remains pretty strong. Institutional analysts have continued to treat Solana as one of the few major altcoins with a real chance of long-term outperformance, mainly because of its speed, low fees, growing stablecoin activity, and its ability to attract both speculative and practical on-chain use. At the same time, some targets have been cut from earlier highs, which reflects the reality that the market is not pricing Solana as some unstoppable straight-line winner anymore. It still has upside, but it has to earn it. My verdict on Solana is that it is still one of the better large-cap altcoin holdings, but it is not quite as clean as Ethereum. If you own it, I would frame it as a serious contender for strong performance rather than a guaranteed all-time high reclaim. The upside is real, but it depends on continued usage growth, continued developer activity, and the network proving it is more than just the place where the hottest meme coin happens to launch. If Solana keeps broadening out, it can still perform very well. If not, it risks becoming more cyclical than many holders want to admit. Then we come to XRP, and this is probably the most emotionally charged coin on the list because a lot of people listening will either hold it with deep conviction or avoid it completely. XRP's supply structure is more controlled than many altcoins because a large share of the supply has historically been placed in escrow and released on a schedule, rather than just flooding the market in a chaotic way. That makes it more predictable than the average altcoin unlock nightmare. But predictable does not automatically mean bullish. This is where the analyst picture becomes much more mixed. Some bullish forecasts still argue XRP has a route toward major upside if regulatory clarity improves, if Ripple keeps building real-world financial relationships, and if payment-related utility actually expands in a meaningful way. On the other hand, several institutions have cut their XRP outlook materially compared with earlier, more optimistic calls. That tells you the market still sees potential in XRP, but it no longer wants to blindly assume the old community dream scenario just because the legal cloud has partly cleared. So what does that mean for your portfolio if you are holding XRP? My verdict is that XRP is not dead, but it is also not as clean a comeback story as the loudest voices online make it sound. I would call it a conditional bull case. If Ripple can keep expanding utility, if stablecoin efforts around the broader ecosystem help, and if regulatory clarity keeps opening doors, then XRP can still perform. But if that real-world adoption does not translate into a stronger market narrative and stronger sustained demand, it could continue to underwhelm relative to the size of its fan base. So for listeners holding XRP, I would not panic on it. But I also would not blindly assume an all-time high reclaim is owed to you. Now let's talk about BNB, because this is one of the more quietly interesting large-cap coins in this discussion. BNB actually has one of the better supply stories among major altcoins, because Binance uses a burn mechanism designed to reduce total supply over time. That immediately puts it in a better position than a lot of coins whose tokenomics are constantly diluting holders. BNB's structure is much more supportive than people sometimes realize. And that matters because when you combine a deflation-supportive design with one of the biggest crypto ecosystems in the world, you get a much more serious investment case than people often give it credit for. BNB also benefits from the fact that it is tied to an exchange ecosystem, a smart contract chain, and a broader product environment that continues to generate relevance. So when people ask whether BNB could still perform, the answer is yes, absolutely. It is one of the more defensible large-cap names from a tokenomics point of view. My verdict on BNB is that it is still one of the stronger major altcoins and one of the less broken structures in this whole conversation. I would not put BNB anywhere near the done bucket. In fact, if you are building a portfolio around major altcoins that still have a realistic path to strength, BNB deserves to be in that discussion. The only reason it sometimes gets less attention is because it sits in a slightly different category from the more retail-hyped names, but structurally it remains one of the better-looking large caps. Now we get to Cardano, and this is where the gap between community belief and market performance becomes very important. Cardano has a capped supply, which is a positive. It is not one of those tokens where people are constantly worrying about endless future inflation destroying the price. On paper, that gives it an advantage over a lot of weaker projects. Cardano also continues to build from a technical point of view, and its supporters will rightly point to ongoing work around scaling, development, and ecosystem improvements. But here's the harder truth. Cardano has not consistently translated that technical credibility into the kind of market dominance or user demand that would make an all-time high recovery feel straightforward. That is where the analyst view is noticeably less confident than it is on Ethereum or Solana. Cardano still gets mentioned as a major legacy altcoin with potential upside in the right market, but it is rarely spoken about as the obvious next dominant winner. So if you are holding Cardano, my verdict is this: not dead, but much harder to back as a likely all-time high recovery unless the whole altcoin market becomes properly euphoric again. That does not mean it cannot have strong runs. It can. But if you are asking for a serious grown-up portfolio view, then Cardano looks more like a laggard that needs a lot of things to go right at once. It needs stronger adoption, stronger user pull, and stronger narrative energy. Otherwise, it risks remaining one of those coins where the community stays loyal but the market result keeps disappointing. And finally, we come to Dogecoin, which is always a tricky one because people love to either mock it or worship it. Dogecoin is actually different from many altcoins in one key way. It is not really an unlock-driven dilution story in the same sense. Dogecoin has fixed annual issuance, which means its percentage inflation rate falls over time as the supply base gets larger. So the supply story is not as structurally ugly as people sometimes assume. But that does not automatically make it a strong, serious portfolio bet. Because Dogecoin's real issue is not just supply, it is that a huge amount of its valuation case still depends on sentiment, meme energy, celebrity attention, and the possibility of speculative mania returning. Yes, Dogecoin can absolutely rip in the right environment. Yes, it can outperform for stretches when the market gets irrational and fun again. But if you are trying to assess whether it has the strongest long-term case for reclaiming all-time highs on fundamentals, it is much harder to argue that with conviction. So my verdict on Dogecoin is that it is not done, but it is also not one of the strongest serious all-time high recovery candidates if you are being disciplined. It is more of a culture and sentiment trade than a structurally compelling large-cap investment. If meme mania comes back hard, Dogecoin can absolutely move. But if you are a listener holding Dogecoin and telling yourself it is one of the cleanest long-term portfolio positions in crypto, I think you need to be honest with yourself. It is a more fragile case than Ethereum, Solana, or BNB. So if we bring this all together and make it practical for your portfolio, the cleanest way to think about it is this. Ethereum, Solana, and BNB are the strongest names in this group if you are looking for large-cap altcoins that still have a realistic path to powerful performance. Ethereum has the cleanest serious comeback case. Solana still has a very strong upside case, but it carries more inflation and more execution risk. BNB has one of the better supply structures and deserves more respect than it often gets. So what does that mean for your portfolio if you are holding XRP? My verdict is that XRP is still one of the more credible comeback candidates among the major altcoins because there is still a real bullish case behind it, not just community loyalty. The supply story is more controlled than many rivals because of Ripple's escrow structure, and that gives the market more predictability than the usual altcoin unlock mess. On the analyst side, the range is still wide, but it is bullish enough to matter. Standard Chartered cut its end 2026 XRP target from $8 to $2.80 after the February sell-off, while still keeping a much higher longer-term view, and another analyst view cited by CoinDesk put XRP at around $10 by 2030, if regulatory clarity and Ripple ecosystem adoption keep building. And Dogecoin is the wild card. It can absolutely run, but it is not the kind of large cap I would present as one of the strongest serious recovery bets unless the market becomes very speculative again. And that is really the whole point of this two-part deep dive. Part 1 was about why token supply destroys weaker altcoins. Part 2 is about survival. Which major coins still have the structure, the supply design, the analyst support, and the market credibility to fight their way back, and which ones may never properly recover at all. Because this is what matters for your portfolio now. It is not enough to say a coin is popular. It is not enough to say it has a strong community. It is not enough to say it used to trade much higher. You need to ask harder questions. Is the supply under control? Is demand real? Are serious analysts still backing it? Is there real usage underneath the chart? And most importantly, if this coin never gets back to its old high, would you still feel comfortable holding it based on what it actually is today? That is the question more people need to ask. Because in this market, nostalgia is not a strategy. Hope is not a strategy. And just because a coin was a star once does not mean it will automatically become a star again. Drop your thoughts in the comments, smash like, follow, And as always, we will see you at the top.